Hey guys, today for our real estate studying, I'm going over Colorado contracts and forms. So if you do not live in Colorado and you're studying for the real estate exam, I do have the two links below posted for the federal portion. If you do live in Colorado, let's get started. All right, our first term on here is specific performance. What is specific performance? This is suing if the buyer or seller does not end up performing under specific terms of the contract. So there's about 50 ways for a buyer to get out of a contract and not many for the seller. So typically it's the buyer suing the seller for specific performance and not the other way around. But if the buyer checks the box for specific performance and they default on the contract, the seller can sue them to buy the house. Now the buyer is the one filling out the contract, so they're likely not going to risk that much. If the box isn't checked and the default provision is liquidated damages, then the default would be liquidated damages. So for example, if the buyer defaults on the contract, the liquidated damages would be the earnest money they gave the seller. They would not get their earnest money back. And again, all of this can be disputed and settled in court. But that is what specific performance is. Usually it doesn't apply to the seller because there's not a lot of ways that a seller can get out of a contract. Next is a question, what does a seller need to provide and disclose if their residential building permit was issued before 1978? So they must disclose any known lead-based paint hazard. They must provide a lead-based paint warning. The broker must make sure the lead-based paint accompanies any offer. Those are the three things that need to be disclosed if the house is built before 1978. That's when they realized that paint was made with lead. Mill levy. What's our mill levy? So this is the taxable value of a property. So if a house is worth $300,000, and the tax rate is 30 mills, the equation would be 300,000 times 30, which equals 9 million. Divide that by 1,000, and that's 9,000. So these finance questions will be on the test. That's our mill levy, the taxable value of a property. And just remember to divide it by 1,000. In the contract to buy and sell, who pays the appraisal fee? The cost of the appraisal fee is negotiated between the buyer and seller. And remember, an appraisal is the unbiased professional opinion of the value of the home. Typically, the buyer pays, but technically it can be negotiated. All closing costs can be negotiated. According to the residential contract to buy and sell real estate, what can a buyer do who is dissatisfied with the inspection results? So what can an unhappy buyer do that is not happy with the inspection results? They can terminate the contract with written notice immediately. Terminate the contract. So this is one of the 50 ways that a buyer can get out of the contract. So a seller cannot sue the buyer for specific performance in this case, because if the buyer isn't happy with the inspection, they can get out of the contract immediately. Give the seller written notice. Don't like the inspection, I'm out. What is the purpose of listing licensee providing information on square footage? Brought the in there. That's why this one sounds confusing. What is the purpose of the licensee providing on the listing information on the square footage? So what's the point of an agent putting the square footage on a listing? Should have wrote it that way the first time. So this is for marketing purposes only. I put an exclamation point because I've seen this so many times and I've watched so many videos and listened to so many podcasts where this is going to be on the test. So again, the purpose of the square footage on a listing is for marketing purposes only. So square footage may not be exact. It is not for a loan, valuation, or any other purposes besides marketing. So if the buyer and seller are definitely advised to verify this information, and if the buyer does want an exact measurement, that has to be done by the buyer before any deadlines in the contract. When can a buyer withdraw an offer to a seller? When can a buyer withdraw an offer to a seller? Has to be prior to the listing broker delivering it to the sellers. So once the seller has accepted and signed the contract, the buyers may no longer withdraw. If a seller makes a counter offer to the buyer, what happens to the buyer's original offer? If a seller counters the buyer's offer, that offer is considered rejected. So if a buyer offers $490,000 on a house listed at $500,000 and the seller counters at $495,000, the buyer can turn down the counter offer and there is no deal. The seller cannot go back and say, well, never mind, I'll accept the $490,000. By making a counter offer, that original offer is rejected and the buyer is no longer obligated to that contract. So that's why it's important that real estate agents give good negotiating advice. If you have a house that's hot on the market, you have to be careful with those counter offers, because if you do give a counter offer, the original offer you had is off the table. The buyer is no longer liable to that contract. What would a buyer order to see if there is an encroachment on the property? So there's two things: an improvement location certificate or a survey. Remember, an encroachment is where the property owner builds or extends something on their neighbor's land, and a survey is the process of locating and measuring the exact amount of land the homeowner has. So again, that's something that the buyer would have to do. They can order that improvement location certificate or a survey. A longish one here: if a completed lead-based paint disclosure form is not attached to a sales contract in which a building permit for a residential dwelling was issued prior to January 1st, 1978, the contract is void, voidable, or lacking and may be amended or extended. It is void. You have to have that disclosure. Lead paint disclosures have to be there or the contract is void. A buyer's earnest money is held by whoever is named in the contract to hold it. The contract to buy and sell gives the authority to a named entity, normally either the broker or the title company. So whatever is going to be listed in the contract is who is holding the earnest money. Lots of earnest money questions on this exam. Of the following, which may not be used as earnest money? Cash, check, a note, or a deed of trust. So which may not be used as earnest money in Colorado? A cash, check, a note, or a deed of trust. You cannot use a deed of trust as earnest money. Remember, in a deed of trust, there are three parties involved: the trustor, who's the borrower, the lender, who's the beneficiary, and a trustee who holds the title to the property as collateral between the lender and borrower. So that is what a deed of trust is. Doesn't even make any sense to be used as earnest money. So if you see deed of trust is an option, you cannot use a deed of trust for earnest money. You can use cash, a check, or a note. Is earnest money required with a contract in Colorado? Do you even need earnest money here? Nope, it is not required for a valid contract in Colorado. So the buyer can say they aren't giving any earnest money, and if the seller agrees, that is a valid contract. What happens if the seller refuses to fill out the seller's property disclosure form? Seen this question a few times. The buyer may insist. The seller still must disclose any property defects in the property that they know about. So the seller still has to disclose those known property defects. And in that form, the seller's property disclosure, it's all yeses and no boxes. You check them. It's about like the sewer and the roofing and everything. Now, if the buyer insists on having that form filled out and the seller refuses, that's another one of the 50 ways the buyer can get out of the contract. So if you're a buyer and your seller refuses to fill out that property disclosure form, they don't have to, but you can say, I'm out. So it's one of the ways to say that's not going to work for me. Contract's terminated. In the contract, do you have to disclose the source of water and supply? That is a simple yes, you have to do this. Don't let the test confuse you. This is the only time this information needs to be disclosed. You only have to do this once. So just put the address and the name of the water provider. Unless the property is served by a well, then you have to go into more information. But just remember, for the source of water and supply, you only have to fill that out once. What does the earnest money holder do if there's a controversy over the earnest money? So I know there's lots of test questions on section 24 in contracts about earnest money disputes. So I want to put all the options here. There's not just one option if there's a controversy over the earnest money. So what the first option is to wait for any proceedings between the buyer and seller. So let's say the title company is holding the money and they can just say, hey, we'll wait and let you guys go to mediation and basically agree to whatever you guys agree to. The second option is to interplead all parties and deposit earnest money into a court of competent jurisdiction. So if the mediation fails and one party files a lawsuit, the title company will give the earnest money to the judge to give it to whoever the judge says wins. And the money holder will be entitled to recover the court cost. The third option is to provide notice to the buyer and seller that unless earnest money holder receives a copy of the summons and complaint or claim within 120 days, the keyword there is within 120 days, the earnest money will be returned to the buyer. And then the fourth option is basically nothing happens. The earnest money holder hasn't received a copy of a lawsuit happening and they didn't interplead the money to the court. They still have to disperse the money pursuant to the order of the court if there is a lawsuit. So if there is a lawsuit, they still have to give that money based on what the judge says. So those are pretty much the four options that can happen if there is an earnest money dispute. I think that's it with earnest money. So moving on, in order to extend the deadline for loan objection, in order to extend a deadline for a loan objection, a broker must get permission from the lender, the buyer, or the seller. They must get permission from the seller. In order to extend the deadline date for loan conditions, the broker must obtain the seller's permission since it is the buyer's deadline. The extension must be in writing and signed by both parties. What does the contract to buy and sell specify about the seller's disclosure form? So we just went over this. What does the contract to buy and sell specify about the seller's disclosure form? That the seller will, in all caps locks, provide it. That the seller will provide it. Watch the wording there. If it's multiple choice, watch the wording. Because the seller's disclosure form is not mandatory. The contract to buy and sell just says it will be provided. So if there's any options about having to fill out the form or it being mandatory, those are not correct. Look for the word provide when it comes to the seller's disclosure form. Because remember, the seller can say, no, I'm not going to fill it out. I'll provide it, but I'm not filling it out. And the buyer can say, well, if you don't fill it out, contract's terminated. But that form does need to be provided, doesn't have to be filled out. Why does the buyer's broker sign the contract to buy and sell? Why does the buyer's broker sign the contract to buy and sell? As a receipt for earnest money. So this is not one of the listing agreements where you sign to be assured commission. This is a buy and sell contract. Remember, the buy and sell contracts regard the property and the principal, not the agency relationship. So the broker signs that contract to buy and sell as a receipt for earnest money. What happens if the inspection deadlines are missed? What happens if any inspection deadlines are missed? The contract terminates. So there's an inspection deadline, a termination deadline. That's where the buyer can get out of the contract. And then there's an objection resolution deadline. This allows the buyer and seller to either come to an agreement or cancel the contract. So the buyer is usually going to get their earnest money back for anything prior to inspection deadlines. Keep in mind there's a notice to terminate form that has to be filled out. If there's an agreement, the inspection resolution form is used. Or if they need more time to make repairs or get a loan, this is the amend extend form. So you have to pick one form or the other. Amend means to change. You can't have a resolution form and a change form at the same time. What is the main purpose of the final walkthrough inspection before closing? That final walkthrough inspection. So that final walkthrough inspection is to verify that the condition of the property meets the requirements of the contract. So it's to make sure the property is the same as how they bought it and any agreed upon updates after the inspection. So the inspection has already happened at this point. Now is not the time to re-inspect and bring up any other issues. This needed to be done prior to the inspection deadline. The final walkthrough is just to make sure the property is how they bought it, meets the requirements that are in the contract. Not the time to bring up new requirements in the contract. All right, we're going to addendums. Addendums now. Are addendums to the contract required in real estate contracts? It's supposed to be a little asterisk there. So are these required in real estate contracts? Do you have to have addendums? No, addenda to the contracts are not required unless certain individual situations arise. So we're going to go over some of those situations and where we will need to use them. So what's a short sale addenda? Short sale addenda. This is any sale of real estate that equals less than what is owed. It's the alternative to foreclosure. So that one's easy to remember. Short sale, less than what is owed. What is a buyout addendum? Buyout addendum. I've definitely seen these on the practice exams. So a buyout addendum is when a licensee uses a commission-approved addendum to buy one of their listed properties. So one of their listed properties. Apologize for some of the errors on here. So this is usually to facilitate the property owner's purchase of another property. They do not need a buyout addendum for purchasing personal property. So if a real estate agent lists a house and they're actually looking for a house themselves, and they're like, oh my gosh, I love this house that I've listed actually, they would need a buyout addendum because that is their listing. But if a real estate agent is just looking for a house to buy, not one of their listings, they found it on MLS or on Zillow, then they don't need the buyout addendum. So just remember, a buyout addendum is only required for licensees if it's one of their listed properties. A post-occupancy agreement addendum is valid for how many days? How long is that post-closing occupancy agreement valid for? Up to 60 days. After 60 days, a properly drafted lease is recommended. So this addendum is offered as a tool for a broker to use when a residential transaction calls for a seller to remain in possession of the property, seller rent back after closing. The seller sells the house and rents it to whoever they want or to whoever bought it from them for up to 2 months. It is intended for short-term occupancy, 1 to 60 days. The post-closing occupancy agreement form is intended to address major risk and responsibilities of a delayed possession following closing and should be completed at the time of the contract. And then anything after 60 days, you should really get a solid lease drafted. So the Colorado Foreclosure Protection Act. So we're moving on to notice, disclosures, and some other forms here. So what is the Colorado Foreclosure Protection Act for? This act gives the seller the right to cancel their contract. It was made so the sale and foreclosure of a home is done in a fair manner. So sellers don't have a lot of ways to get out of contracts, but this Foreclosure Protection Act does help sellers that are going under foreclosure. So let's say someone's house is worth $500,000 and it's being sold under foreclosure for $300,000, but a family member comes in and says, "Hey, I'll help you out. No way you should sell it for that low. I'll buy it for $400,000. If this happens, as the seller, you do have the right to cancel that foreclosure contract and get out of it. So your buyer signs an objection inspection notice and you, the licensee, deliver it to the listing broker's office via fax. Has the seller received the objection? So is the seller considered to have received that objection if you fax it to their office? Yes. As soon as the listing broker receives the objection, it is deemed to have been delivered to the seller. This is also true for other electronic deliveries such as email or e-signature programs, so long as the parties have elected to allow them. A good practice is to always ask the listing and selling broker if their customers and clients require a specific delivery method or if they will accept electronic delivery. So basically, communication is key here when it comes to delivering anything between buyers and sellers. But yes, if you send it to their office via fax, it is considered delivered. Just a couple more. What happens if the seller remains in the home past the agreed upon possession date and time? The buyers may evict the sellers and receive a daily charge as specified in the contract until they vacate. So in that part of the closing contract, you want to make sure that you write down a daily rate that's pretty high so we don't even have to deal with it, at least a few hundred bucks. So you don't want to have a buyer that can't get into the house they just bought because the seller is still there. No, it's hard to leave a home that you love, but if you sell it, you got to get out. Last one here, if a residential dwelling unit built before 1978 has lead-based paint damage, who is most at risk? So young children are most at risk for that lead if there's lead-based paint. This has to be in the disclosure of information on lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazard lead warning statements. Remember, the point of all these disclosures and regulations made by the commission is to protect the public. So that's why we see a lot of lead-based paint questions. All right, you guys. So that is it for our real estate exam studying for today. We went over Colorado contracts and forms. We also covered some addendums and disclosures in there. I hope this helps you guys in studying for your real estate exam here in Colorado. If it does, hit that like button, and best of luck studying, and thank you for watching.